When we're undergoing any sort of ERP implementation that involves multiple nations, international scope, there's a lot of things that need to be considered. And implementing ERP in Asia is no different. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting, and I'm here in Hong Kong visiting clients. And while I've been here, it's really helped open my eyes a bit more and a bit further in understanding what does it take to be successful with ERP implementations in Asia as well as other parts of the world. And there's some lessons learned and some nuances of ERP implementations that involve Asia that need to be considered, whether the implementations are based in Asia or even if you're an American company or a European company or some other region that has international operations that involve Asian operations. These considerations are really important for you to understand and for all of us to understand before implementing an ERP solution in Asia. First of all is the concept of independence. I'm actually here in Hong Kong at the time that there's protests happening. Some Hong Kong residents are protesting the involvement of China and the lack of independence or perceived independence from China and some of the Chinese laws that are being enacted. And it's a good reminder that all of us, to some degree, want to be independent. We want independence from our parent companies, and we want the flexibility to be able to operate as we have locally and really meet the needs of our local customers. But there's also independence from biases in the ERP software industry, biases in particular, that are very important for these types of implementations. And that's no different in Asia or any other part of the world. We need to make sure that decisions we make are being done in the context of what's right for the locality or the local areas that are being affected by the implementation, as well as making sure that our decisions are independent and agnostic from industry biases. So those are some of the things that we need to think about when we think about independence and ERP implementations in Asia in particular. The second thing to think about, and this is another thing that is also relevant for any sort of ERP implementation involving international scope, is this concept of cultural differences. Not every country is the same. There's a lot of cultural nuances that need to be considered as we're looking at how we're going to implement ERP across the world. And this is especially true if we're looking to harmonize or standardize business processes across different locations. We need to understand that there's a lot of cultural differences that we need to take into account, or at least know how to navigate, not to say that we completely defer to those cultural differences or let culture override how we implement technology, but we need to be aware of what the nuances are and what the implications are for our implementation. So it affects business processes. It also affects how we manage organizational change. So there are a lot of cultural differences that, for example, we as Americans are used to being very direct in the way we communicate and the way we manage organizational change. That's not necessarily the best style for a lot of Asian countries. So we need to figure out how can we play to the strengths of the Asian cultures in the different countries that we're operating in, whether it's relationship-based focus on some of our organizational change, whether it's more collaborative, whether it's playing to the deference that most workers have for higher ups. There's a structure and a hierarchy that is more respected in Asian cultures in general, and I'm making some generalizations here, so please take some of this with a grain of salt. But those are the types of things we need to be aware of as we're implementing in Asia. Our change management strategy may look very different in Asian countries than it looks in Europe or in South America or in North America, wherever the case may be. So those are some things to be aware of from a cultural difference perspective. Now, the third thing is when we think about how we're going to harmonize business processes or act as one company, back to the point of change management, we need to make sure that we really focus on organizational change and understand where we can be flexible in our business operations and the way ERP is implemented, and where we can't be, or where we're going to be a bit more unwavering on achieving standardization and harmonization. Anytime I hear a company talk about how they want to standardize across their global operations, I take it with a grain of salt, and I'm a little skeptical. Not to say that it can't be done, but I think a lot of organizations underestimate what that really means and how difficult it's going to be from a change management perspective, and also just from an operational perspective, trying to figure out how you're going to standardize across multiple countries that have a lot of different strengths and a lot of different ways of doing things, especially if you've grown through acquisition. So those are some of the things to think about too in terms of how we implement ERP as it relates to harmonization or standardization of business processes. Now, another unique factor of ERP implementations in Asia is that there is a skills and resource gap in the ERP software industry in general. And by in general, I mean globally. There's a skill and resource gap simply because so many of these products that are being rolled out now, like S/4HANA, Dynamics 365, Oracle Cloud, they don't have a strong history with a lot of resources that have been certified, implemented multiple times. A lot of these resources out in the marketplace are still learning the product as they're implementing. And so when we look to some far-reaching countries that are outside call it the regional headquarters of some of the software vendors or the big system integrators, it can be even harder to find good resources that can support your project. And when we're talking about a global skills gap, it can be even harder when you're an outlying country where you have to fly people in from, in the case of some of the Asian countries, they need to fly people in from Hong Kong. For example, we have a client in Indonesia where a lot of resources would likely be coming from Hong Kong. So the question becomes, will companies in Hong Kong take priority over those in Indonesia, and will it be harder for companies based in Indonesia to get good qualified resources, or will Hong Kong get the higher priority resources simply because more of those resources are here in Hong Kong? So those are some of the things to think about as we navigate these types of projects. And again, it's not to say you shouldn't do an ERP implementation, but it's just to say that we need to be aware of this and mindful that getting resources might be difficult, and we might need to adjust our expectations in our overall ERP implementation plan accordingly. Now, a somewhat related point that's similar to the point about the skills and resource gap is when we look at the big system integrators and their priorities and where they focus their best resources and their time and their efforts, a lot of times it's going to be those companies that are closer to home. So a big system integrator or even a mid-tier system integrator that has an office in, say, Hong Kong or Bangkok, whatever the city may be, they're going to likely defer or prefer having a focus on those companies there. So if you're an outlying area like Philippines or Indonesia, certain parts of China, then it may be difficult to get the attention and the focus and the prioritization as a client of these big software vendors and ERP system integrators. And then finally, another thing to think about is the whole cloud movement. With so many cloud options in the marketplace right now, and the fact that most ERP vendors are moving to the cloud, we really have to think about what does that mean to our rollout in rural parts of Asia. So there's two components here that we have to think about. One is the infrastructure. Do we have the infrastructure to support a cloud solution in all the different parts of our Asian operations? Certainly in places like Hong Kong, where I'm at now, that's not really an issue. But when I get to outlying parts of China or some rural parts of Indonesia, for example, those are going to be more difficult to have reliable infrastructure that can support cloud solutions. So the question becomes, what do we do? How do we mitigate that risk? How do we ensure redundancy? Is there some sort of on-prem redundancy we can provide, or what's our risk mitigation strategy for that whole cloud reality? And the second component of the whole cloud difference in Asia, or something that's somewhat unique to think about in Asian ERP implementations, is data. When we think about data and where the data resides, there's some laws here, as there are in other parts of the world, that require the data to reside in whatever country they're operating in. So for example, in China, ERP implementations in China require that the data center, if it's hosted in the cloud, the data actually needs to stay in China. So if we have a data center here in Hong Kong or in Bangkok or whatever the case may be, that doesn't necessarily help us. So we've got to figure out how are we going to ensure that our hosting plan and our cloud provider can abide by local laws and regulations as it relates to data. And of course, that opens up the whole data privacy discussion as well. So these are some of the things to think about and some of the nuances of ERP implementations in China. I've covered this in Asia. So I've covered this at a very high level, but there's certainly a lot more detail we can go into. But if I were to summarize the two takeaways as it relates to ERP implementations in Asia, first is change management. Organizational change is critical to the success of any ERP implementation, but especially when we're talking about multinational implementations, and especially when we're talking about unique cultures like in some of the Asian countries. So again, I use the example of me as an American and the American culture compared to the Asian cultures. They're very different. There's a lot of nuances, a lot of different strengths and weaknesses, and we have to really understand how are we going to navigate that differently in different parts of the world. Different countries within Asia are going to have their own different unique cultures, and most of those are going to be very distinct from and different from American cultures, South American cultures, European cultures, etc. So that's the first thing, is we really need to focus on our global organizational change management strategy for some of these Asian countries that are affected by our ERP implementation. And then finally, the other big takeaway here is, how do we inject a sense of independence and a technology agnostic view of how we can best manage our implementation here in Asia and other parts of the world, to ensure that we aren't just getting the vendor Kool-Aid or the vendor biases and the vendor spin, or the system integrator biases and system integrator spin, to ensure that we make decisions that are best for us, to help us find the best resources, to find the best technologies that best fit our operations, to find the best overall cloud strategy, the resourcing strategy, to help navigate some of these things that we've talked about throughout this video. So I hope you find this content helpful. We certainly have helped many organizations throughout Asia and other parts of the world with their ERP implementations. I've included a link below to our 2019 ERP report, which covers some of the nuances and the benchmarks of these global implementations that we've been involved with. So I encourage you to download that using the link below. I also encourage you, if you enjoyed this content in this video, to please subscribe to my channel, like the video, and share it with any of your colleagues. Hope you found this very helpful, and hope you all have a great day. Take care.